Here with you this afternoon to get to know our Lord and his best friends a little bit more intimately. The disciples are quite a familiar topic, so I hope to create a little bit of, how can I describe this, a frisson of excitement, and I assure you that there'll be some surprises, there'll be some new things learnt, and hopefully some of them I'll actually be able to prove. So we'll then click, I think, on this one. We've got various ones here, so let's just give that a try. So, firstly, the little bit of sort of mental warm-up there was, can we name the 12 disciples? And it's not easy because they have different names. Matthew, Levi, Bartholomew, Nathaniel, Jude, not Iscariot, as Thaddeus, Judas Iscariot leaves, Matthias arrives. So if you got all sort of 17 of those names, you did quite well. 18 was a brownie point. Now, this is not what Jesus did. Jesus did not put an advert in the Jerusalem Gazette with a recruitment agency, various human resource processes and exercises to narrow down and funnel down from a large number of applications, the 12. That positions vacant ad did not exist. My hypothesis is that Jesus' recruitment of his disciples was not random at all. He knew them very well. Many of them he knew intimately from the time that he was a very young boy. So as we look at this little list here, oh, you've got a green one, I've got a red one. In terms of the skills required, I just wanted to focus on one little aspect here. It was a requirement that the disciples were Jesus' familiar friend. We know that from what book in the Old Testament? Very good, from the Psalms. Okay, now you might look at that list and say, well, actually there was a whole large number of other skills that were prerequisite, and I would agree with you. This is just an illustration to say this didn't happen. Now, let's start with the evidence. And I may indeed have the wrong... Oh, no, here we are. So here's the big group. As you can see, there was various lists of the disciples, which again, I suspect we would be quite familiar with. And you can, on this busy overhead, you can sort of identify the first four probably quite readily. I think we know a lot about them. Of all of the disciples, it's probably the first and the last that we know most about, that most is written of. Although curiously, Simon's first, but was he the first disciple called?
Andrew.
Very good. It was Andrew, who we assume was Simon, Peter, Cephas, elder brother. So let's have a look then at this idea. Now, if we're going to identify who was the oldest, who was the youngest, who was the richest, who was the poorest, who was the one that perhaps was a Gentile, we need to be careful about how we tell the story. And I think I have a bit of a preconception, to be fair, that this group was really, really quite close. So when I think about the times that in families draw us closer, it's these type of events, isn't it? It's the special holidays, the meals, it's the get-togethers, the weddings. Sadly, sometimes it's also the funerals. So these are the topics that we'll attempt to get through tonight. But ultimately, this really is a story of Jesus' best friends. At the Last Supper, Jesus said to his disciples, "It's with desire I have desired to eat this meal with you." He really needed them to see it through, but not as the psalmist prophesied. I think he needed his friends to be his soulmates, not just for the time that he was ministry in those 3 and a bit years. But he also needed to have confidence that after he'd gone, they wouldn't dissolve into their previous life, or they wouldn't disappear, but they would be the preachers that would transform the world. So, my hypothesis again. Jesus' circle of friends was a very tight circle, and that consisted mainly of men who were family, who he grew up with, who he knew. So let's think about some special times for us. Perhaps we might, if I was just to sort of think about a special time, it might involve a holiday or an event. It might even involve a special bottle of wine that I was saving for a particular event. Now, I must like special events a lot because I do save particular bottles of wine for these occasions. But I can't really remember. Apart from one occasion, I really tried to think hard about this. Apart from one occasion, I cannot remember a single bottle of wine I ever shared, apart from my father-in-law's sort of wake. I can remember that one. But for the rest of them, I can't. But I know the people who I shared it with. See, that's what forms relationships, isn't it? It's the time that we spend with people. And this is why Jesus perhaps has chosen one cousin over another. So we have to start this journey, sadly, at the foot of the cross. At the foot of the cross, the first disciple we meet is John. He is called the Son of Thunder. Yeah. And John had a brother. He sounded like a good chap. He sounded like a very good chap. Very good. And the way that John describes himself in his letters, of course, he not only scribed the gospel, but the 3 little epistles there in Revelation, he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. And each of the gospel writers have their own little special signature. But our focus at the moment isn't so much on John, but it's at the women who were at Jesus' feet. Now, this is a bit of a tough question, but can anyone remember the names of those women who were at Jesus' feet on the cross? Big loud voices. Which one?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene, yeah, good.
Mary the mother.
Mary, Jesus' mother.
Another Mary the mother of Clopas.
Oh, now, controversial. Yes and no. And there was another lady.
Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, we've got Mary Magdalene.
Mary the wife of Cleopas.
Yeah. So we've got the wife of Cleopas. I don't know whether her name's Mary. And the other woman that we know, she is the mother of the mother of James and John. All right, so let's have a look at that. So here they all are. These are the 2 comparable records. So where we have first is we've got Mary Magdalene there. We've got Mary, the mother of James and Joses, who I believe is Mary, the wife of... You were close, pretty close. So if it's Clopas, Cleophas, it depends on the version. But it's believed that Cleopas was the same person as Alpheus. Now we know that Alpheus had a son who was also called James. Now this isn't to be confused with the son of thunder. This James was called James the Less. Or I think the churches sometimes call him James the Younger. And we have Jesus' mum. And we've got another couple of women here. We've got his mother's sister, and we've got the mother of Zebedee's children. Now, I've been a bit tricky, haven't I? Because I've got the Matthew record, I've got the John record, but subversively, I haven't put the Mark record up. Now, that might be a little clue that could be the glue to bind all of these mysteries together. So, Luke, by the way, in his record, names no women. Matthew and Mark say that there were many women. And we might remember a lady who was a follower of Jesus whose name was Joanna. She was the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's servant, and probably an eyewitness to the conversation between sort of Herod and Pontius Pilate. She understood some of that politics that was going on. But here we've got those women mentioned. Thank you. Now, Joses, by the way, is sort of a Greek form of the word or the name Joseph. Joseph. So, not Joseph's the Lord's stepfather, but can we think of another Joseph in the Bible, in the New Testament? Joseph of Arimathea, very good. It's not him. I doubt it. Even for me, that would be quite rubbery. All right, so how about we start with the two best known? So, the mother of Zebedee's children. Right, so I'm just travelling down here. So, that's pretty busy, isn't it? All right, so we've met Peter and Andrew already. Andrew go and finds Peter. We know where they lived, and we actually know quite a bit about Peter, don't we? In my Sunday school lesson today, we did the lesson of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. We also know the name of Peter's dad because he's called Simon Bar. Very good. You are on fire. I don't think you missed one. You are doing really well. So they were fishermen. They lived in a fishing town. We know that Peter was married because he had a mother-in-law. We know that he had children, and we know that Jesus nursed those children. He cuddled them. And we know Andrew and Peter's dad. We've got that one, Jonah, or John maybe. I also suspect they were quite wealthy. So Andrew and Peter lived together with Peter's family and apparently the extended family. So this is quite a big house. Was he the wealthiest? No. Stay tuned. All right, so now we've got James and John, and we know their father was named Zebedee. Zebedee. Again, they were also fishermen. Never met a James I haven't liked, so I like the sound of this James. The son of thunder. He sounds sort of robust and masculine, doesn't he? Thunder. In the Old Testament, when we have a look at how thunder is used, it's mainly used to describe the voice of God. The voice of God. There's a number of references I could turn you to. I suspect that has got something to do with their vocation after Jesus had left, that title. I think the issue is not the thunder, but it's the voice. That they were to be Jesus' advocates and Jesus' spokespeople, persons. The disciples in general, but these two in particular were to be leaders. I've called this group the primary quartet because in all of the lists they're always named first. It's always these four. If we spend a little bit of time in John chapter 1 with the calling of the disciples and that story, the background to that story is Jesus is having a conversation with John the Baptist. There's two disciples that go off with Jesus. They sit in Jesus' house and listen to him. I don't know whether Jesus and his family were still living at Nazareth at this stage. I suspect not. I think the evidence is that they'd moved to Capernaum. Bethsaida, which we might be familiar with, which might pop up later, which is where Andrew and Peter lived. We're not quite sure where that is, but it's probably 3 miles either side of Capernaum, one way or the other. It's pretty close, or it's a suburb. Okay, so John is probably talking to Andrew and John, the son of Zebedee. Andrew runs off to his brother first. That language is quite specific. And then eventually, probably a couple of hours later, and not too far away, John meets up with his brother James and says, "We believe we have found the Messiah." So although Andrew was the older brother of Simon, I don't think he's the oldest disciple. We also know, quite conveniently, the name of their mother. The mother, her name was Salome. Salome, okay? That's sort of the female equivalent of the Hebrew word in Greek. And her name means peace. So, you imagine this beautiful lady that's really caring and thoughtful, gentle, kind, and she's got these raging masculine boys who are big, bulky fishermen. Well, Salome had a sister. We know that. And they spoke funny. All of these fishermen spoke funny. Because they're Galileans. So remember, on the night of Jesus' crucifixion, that servant girl says to Peter, "You're a Galilean, your language betrays you." So maybe you're a Queenslander, because you say, "Hey, but hey," it must have been a bit something along those lines. So now let's put all of this together. So we've just gone back to those two parallel records there, and what we see is this. The mother of Zebedee's children and his mother's sister were actually one in the same person. When we go to the Mark 15 verse 40 record, anyone got a Bible open? Dave, you want to read Mark 15 verse 40? Any version is fine.
There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome.
Okay, good. So I'm going over to the board here. It's called Zebedee. So that establishes to me beyond doubt that Mary had a sister whose name was Salome. Salome was married to Zebedee. They had two children whose names were James and John. So I never do maths on the spot, but am I 20% there? My hypothesis is that Jesus' disciples, his circle, were really quite close in time. Well, we've got two cousins. Happy so far? Good. Sorry, this is me probably giving some feedback. All right then. So now we want to have a quick look at the second quartet. Now, because there are different names and different people, it's okay to drift off, because eventually we'll have the whiteboard filled. It probably will be so full and busy that you might need to take a photo and reflect on it. But we want to get a hold, firstly, of Philip and Bartholomew. Bartholomew had another name. His other name was Nathaniel. That other name is only referenced in the Gospel of John. So we want to talk now about Philip, Bartholomew, and eventually we'll get to Matthew. Oh, gee, I made that easy. Okay, good. I thought you were all so bright. You're just reading my notes. You're cheating. Okay, anyone cheats again, you get 10 push-ups. Okay, what do we know about these people? Well, firstly, we know that Philip lived in the same town as Andrew. It says that. The lakeside suburb, beautiful lakeside suburb of Bethsaida. Now, what are we talking about here? He knew Andrew and Peter. The same message of following me is given to Philip like it was to the other four. But when we reflect on, say, the characters, and while we're not doing a character study of the disciple, it's important to just make a note of this. Nathaniel was the type of person that, aside from one little story, we know virtually nothing about. He was someone that was comfortable staying in the background. He wasn't someone that saw preeminence, or he wasn't a leader, it doesn't appear. So Philip must have known both Jesus and Joseph, because in the story in John chapter 1, he says to Nathaniel, "Hey, look, mate, I've got to tell you who I found. I found the Messiah, and he's Joseph, the carpenter's son from Nazareth." You know, You know those guys, they just live sort of over the mountain there. So they were known to both of them. So Nathanael was introduced to Jesus through Philip, and it appears that he was martyred in Armenia, either by decapitation or being skinned alive or both. So you often see him depicted holding his flailed skin and the flaying knife. So that's sort of how he's been depicted there in history. We need to spend just a little bit of time thinking about what Nathanael was thinking about. When Jesus finds him, he says that he was sitting somewhere. Does anyone remember where Jesus saw Nathanael sitting? I saw you sitting under a fig tree, Nathanael. All right. And Nathanael was in his own little moment. Philip knew where to find him, which is curious, but Jesus says, I remember seeing you and you were sitting under a fig tree, and I actually remember what you were thinking about. Just pause. We're now going to another significant family event. Again, we know this story really quite well, the wedding in Cana. So here's Bethsaida, there's Capernaum, but Bethsaida could equally be there. So we've got the wedding in Cana, and where's Nazareth? About here. Sorry if that's blurry. But that just gives you a little idea of the geography. We're not talking about places that are really too far away. And in fact, all of the disciples, apart from one, lived in and around the area which I've just highlighted. Who do we know that lives in Cana? This is the culmination of a week of Jesus' life that's been described in John chapter 1 through to this wedding. It was obviously quite a significant event because Mary seems to be in charge of it. Jesus is there, and so are all of his disciples. And it had been quite a massive week for Jesus. It had been a really busy week. He'd announced himself as the Messiah to the authorities. John the Baptist said he's the Lamb of God. John's disciples go off and spend a day with Jesus. Jesus asks Andrew and Simon and James and John to follow him. Then Jesus finds Philip and Nathanael. That's day 5. Now day 7 of this week, which began with Jesus' announcement to the authorities, we're in Cana. And there's a reasonable amount of information about this wedding, relatively speaking. But the obvious question, well, there's many questions about this wedding, but the obvious one is, why is Mary there? Why is Jesus there? Why are 1 or 2 of the 3, 4, 6, 12? Yes. Why are all 12 of the disciples there? So I'm going to assume that we know the story. So I just want to sort of colour in join the dots, colour in some of the perspectives. So firstly, Mary's role is obviously pivotal. So remember, she goes to Jesus and says, in a panic, we're out of wine. We've run out. So I get the sense there that she's wanting to avoid embarrassment for both the bride and groom. She didn't want to diminish the celebration. She wanted to solve the problem. So she decides to independently bring it upon herself to solve the problem, asking Jesus, who she is convinced will solve the problem, because she says to the attendants, whatever he says, just do. It doesn't sound like... I had a great wedding. In fact, our wedding was so good, Catherine and I spent so much time talking to people that the car that was supposed to take us to our destination for our honeymoon nicked off because we were too late. Now, I didn't have a Mary come running up to me, patting me on the shoulder, saying, come on, James, you're going to miss your car. Mary solves the problem. And she wants to do it. So the wine's failed. And now this is a catering disaster. So come on, mums, think about this. Think about if you run out of food at your daughter's wedding or at your son's wedding. Oh, that's just not on, is it? All of the months of preparation. Well, as one writer says, in her maternal solicitude, she calls the situation to her son, seemingly with the assurance that he will solve the problem. So the bridal couple also experience the benefits of Mary's presence, don't they? Because of the dignity she brought to the marriage feast, the relief of their embarrassment, to fulfil satisfactorily the obligations of bride and groom for everyone to have a good time. Now, not only did they have a good time, they had the best time ever because it was the best wine ever. What a crazy thing. Hey, something's going on here. They normally serve the really good stuff at the start, so we can't really tell what the bad stuff is at the end. But Jesus made a superb celebratory wine for these guests. I think it was Mary's, or at least one of Mary's children that got married that day. I suspect that it was one of Mary's daughters, and that's why she was involved. I think all of the disciples were there because they were either really close friends of Jesus or his direct relations. So, is there any more evidence for this, James? At the end of this, which is Jesus' first miracle, it says, and all the disciples believed in him. Well, actually, I don't have too much more evidence apart from this one little clue. Now, Joel, have you got a Bible there? Would you like to just have a look at John 21 for me and verse 2, please? But don't read it just yet. So, we've been introduced to Bartholomew, otherwise known as Nathaniel. Now, Nathaniel sounds like a really beautiful, thoughtful, kind person. If Jesus could look us in the eye and say, well, you're a person in whom there is no deceit, we'd be pretty touched by that, and that's what he says to this man. Jesus knew where to find him, but Jesus could do amazing things. How is it that Philip knew where to find him? Well, perhaps if you're the groom's best man, you know where they'll go to get some peace and quiet away from the women while the final days of the wedding are being organised. Under a fig tree by yourself sounds like a pretty good place to me. Well, hang on, I've thrown something else into the mix here. See, I'm wondering whether Nathaniel was actually the groom and he was getting married to one of Jesus' sisters. I wonder if Philip was the best man. I wonder if all of the disciples there, because they were either related directly or indirectly to the bride or the groom. The glue to cement this story together. Rather rubbery story, I do admit. John 21 verse 2. Now, you have to be carefully listen to this little detail.
Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples.
Okay, so we've met the sons of Zebedee, haven't we? And their mother. What was that little detail about Nathanael? Why would it tell us? The only thing we know about him. He lives in Cana. Now, it's a small smidgen of a clue. It might not be enough to hang our hat on. But let's think about what he was thinking about. So this is what amazed him about Jesus, because Jesus read his mind. We suspect what Nathanael was thinking about was Jacob's life, because Jesus says to him, oh, look, one day you'll see angels meeting the Son of Man going up and down to heaven. So he's got this in his mind. He's thinking about the events that happened in Bethel, the change of Jacob's name. Sound familiar? he's thinking about, well, what was Jacob doing when he was... Oh, yeah, that's right. He was going to find a wife. So if we put these little hints together, I think it creates a nice story. So I'm just going to go over to the whiteboard for a tick because I just want to change something. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that Jesus had brothers and sisters, okay? So we know their names. We don't know his sisters' names, and he could have had more, but he had at least two. So we know that there was Jesus, James, Joseph, Jude, Simon, daughter 1, daughter 2, because that's the order they're given. Did it have to be in that order? Why couldn't it be daughter 1, daughter 2? I've just automatically drawn that because that's how the Bible sort of records it. Jesus, the brothers, the daughters. It didn't have to be like that at all. It's quite possible that any one of these daughters were aged between 20 and 31. 20 and 30, because Jesus is slightly over 30 by this stage. So I'm gonna suspect that, propose, I should say, that one of these daughters has married Nathaniel. Sorry about the spelling, I can't remember if it's a that or a that. There we go. Oh, boom. Good. Now, is anyone going to violently object to this at the moment? Good, you're still with me. I can't hear you, Paul, if you're going to violently object.
Oh, I was going to say that generally they got married much younger than 20 or 21.
Yeah.
14 or...
So what it does, it just creates another little bit of evidence, doesn't it? Because if we suggest that Jesus is 30, there's no mention of Joseph at the wedding, and there's no mention of Joseph at the foot of the cross. So do we suspect that Joseph has passed away? Yeah, well, I think that's a reasonable suspicion. So if there's 7 or 8 kids in the family, quite conceivably, the youngest girl should have been over 12. So, okay, good. Thanks. Well, let's head back to the PowerPoint now. Let's see where we're up to. So we're now just going to pursue the other 2 disciples in the second quartet, Matthew and Thomas. Now, does anyone have any grandkids called Matthew and Thomas? Do we know any Matthew or Thomases? Okay. What's special about Thomas? He was a doubter. His name, a twin. Yeah, all right, they're all good points. So, let's have a look at this first little thing we've got here. Well, I'm trying to create some drama, obviously, because we've only got 20 minutes to go. I don't know, Peter, if I'm going to get through much of Judas. So, we know that Matthew wrote the first gospel, but he had another name. It was Levi. It was Levi. He was a tax collector. So he was quite a bogeyman, but in a somewhat self-effacing way. When he writes about himself, he calls himself a publican. So, I don't know. I guess he's just trying to sort of sandpaper off some rough edges. In all 4 disciple lists, he is linked with Bartholomew, so when they're giving the order. But in the list of Matthew, it's the only occurrence where Bartholomew is mentioned first. It's normally Matthew, then Bartholomew. He had a massive house, huge, enormous property. Mark and Luke say that his house could accommodate an enormous feast. Luke chapter 5, I think, is about the section, where he celebrated his arrival into the disciples' brigade. And he invited Jesus and the disciples and publicans and tax collectors, and a great company to his house. I suspect he, like most collectors, had done very well, and the way that tax collectors succeeded, of course, was by regularly clipping the ticket. So I suspect he had a great wealth. Federal tax man. Now, his fellow Jews probably didn't think too highly of him. So, general question, who loves paying tax? Come on, am I the only one? That's because you pay too much. Everyone that put their hand up, they pay too much, or they know that their taxes hopefully are going to good services, like education and health, David, right? Beautiful. Okay. I loathe paying tax. But anyway, most accountants love tax. So he invites Jesus home for this massive feast. Let's actually go through here, because I'm probably talking to this when I shouldn't be. Yeah, so we know he's a tax collector. Tick. Oh. Well, he's had his name changed. Why is he known as Levi? Levi means joined. Joined. Okay, good. Now, I wasn't given that clue away, Nev. You nailed that. Very well done. Now, rather peculiarly, we've got another little fact. Dan, would you mind just having... Have you got your Bible open? Can you please have a look at Mark chapter 2, verse 14? So, we're just sort of building the story here, aren't we? All right, let's have a look at Mark 2:14, please.
As he went along, he saw Levi, the son of Alpheus, sitting at the tax booth. "Follow me," he said to him, and he got up and followed him.
Now, wait a minute. We've come across Alpheus before, haven't we? And I think we already have established that there was a disciple who was called James, the son of Alpheus. See this circle? It's getting tighter. Levi means joined. Thomas had another name. It was a nickname, Didymus. And you've already told me that Didymus means twin. Is it possible that Levi and Thomas were twins? If it was possible, that means that we have got three brothers on the other side of this family tree ledger that are related to Jesus. This is three more cousins. So there we go. Now, I think I'm almost ready for the next family tree, but we'll see how we go here. We know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So again, another family event that unites us is when one of our friends or one of our friends' children or one of our own children has a little bub. So on this occasion, Joseph and Mary were going to Bethlehem, which was their hometown. We know that. Luke chapter 2 tells us that. Now, we know that Elizabeth was Mary's cousin. We know that they're descended from the same family tree, right? They're both heading through David's line, one through Nathan, one through Solomon. Joseph and Mary, that is. John the Baptist, of course, was Jesus' second cousin, I guess, if Elizabeth is Mary's cousin. Well, what about Salome? Salome is Mary's sister. The family live in Bethlehem. But maybe there had been some reason why the family had all relocated, because Mary and Joseph currently don't live in Bethlehem. They live in Nazareth. Okay. Remember that it wasn't just the birth of Jesus that kept Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem. They had to present him, like all male Jews, after the circumcision within 40 days to the temple. So that's when Anna the prophetess, and is it Simeon, I can't remember, see Jesus. So I'm just going to make one observation about Mary, that I think she is quite an amazing woman. So amazing that God chooses her above all other women to be the bearer of the Saviour of the world and of us. Okay, so now we're going to head across to this family tree. Now, I think I need to go there. All right, cool. I've lost a pen. Cleophas and Alpheus are the same person. You're just going to have to bear with me for one moment. Again, sorry about the spelling. Let's just assume that James, the son of Alpheus, is the eldest. We've got Matthew, otherwise known as Levi. And no doubt here, is that we know Bible chapters. Then we've got Thomas, and there was another son. Remember, we read that in the description of the women at the foot of the cross. The other son's name was Joseph. Okey choke. Now this is quite a lot of kids. In Hierapolis, somewhere between AD 70 and 139, they have found some fragment of a document. It's this fragment of a document that ties up Alpheus and Joseph as being brothers. If you do the research on that, I quite like Harry Whittaker, just love him actually, especially on this topic, is gold. But he uses that, I believe, as sort of his basis for the conclusion that Joseph and Alpheus were in fact brothers. But a lot of third-party researchers, they think this fragment isn't quite enough. The fragment also says that there was another son called Simon and another son called Jude, or Judah. We're going to come across another Jude in just a minute. All right, so cousin Elizabeth, sister, married to Zebedee. Mary and Joseph had children. All right, let's have a look at this next slide here. So another great time for families to bond together, of course, until your kids are teenagers and they don't think it's so cool anymore, is to go on holidays with your kids. Every year, Joseph and Mary and the family went on an annual holiday. Every year, they celebrated the Passover in Jerusalem. We know of one of those times because when Jesus was 12, it was a very bad case of home alone. They've left him. Now, the difference between Macaulay Culkin and Jesus was Macaulay was the youngest, and if you've got a lot of kids, sometimes you forget about the youngest one. But the oldest one, he's normally first in the car because he wants to go home. So under the law in Exodus 21, it was an obligation for males to attend a temple service 3 times a year. Now, when you went for the Passover, if you were living in Nazareth, it wasn't sort of jump in the train and we're there in 3 hours, I think, like it is now. It probably was somewhere between a 6 and an 8-day journey, depending upon which way you travelled. Because remember, Jews didn't like to travel through Samaria. They would go right around the outskirts. But let's just assume that they did. We know that they travelled in a family because there's a big group of people, and traditionally what would happen is the women would go in one group with the children and the men would go with the men in their mates, their buddies, in another group. And so, of course, that's why there's the confusion. I thought you had him, Joseph. Why would I have him? It's your job. You're the mother. You should have looked after Jesus. But they don't know that until the end of the first day. So just imagine the panic that they've lost their son. So off they go, probably in the middle of the night, back another day's journey to go and find him. And then they're knocking on all of the doors of their family where they would have stayed. Have you seen Jesus? No. Didn't he go with you? No. Well, maybe he's at Salome's house. I don't know if he's at Salome's. We've already tried there. Ah, well, have you tried Alpheus? Oh, I don't know. We've tried the uncles, the aunties. We can't find him. And then all of a sudden it just dawns on Mary. Joseph, I know where he is. He's at the temple. Where did Jesus stay these 3 days? It's a pretty spooky thing, isn't it, to think about. If I left my 12-year-old son in that environment, like it's sort of unpalatable. Anyway, he was cared for, God looked after him, and then he was reunited with his parents. But the point here is there is a growing Nazarene family that all travelled together, who all sat around the campfire. The boys hunted, the boys played with each other. You know, there would have been little crushes developed on this little girl over here. Yet, perhaps even Jesus' sister and Nathaniel. Who knows? Okay, so when we just broaden out Joseph's family tree, some of the facts that we know about him we've covered already. So we know his occupation, we know where he lived, we know that he has a brother. Have you ever wondered, after Jesus has left the scene, what actually ever happened to the family group? Like the family unit, the extended family. Have you ever wondered, well, did Jesus' brothers join his service? Uncles, aunties, cousins? Well, there's a bit of evidence to say that they did. That's why we have a James the Elder, not to be confused with James the Less or James the Younger, James the son of Alpheus. Jude, who wrote that little letter, again, is probably Jesus' brother. So we now move on to this third quadrant of disciples. So the last four that we have to deal with are James the son of Alpheus, Jude, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. So James the son of Alpheus is called James the Less. So sometimes we might have assumed that the Less, he's sort of the youngest one, and so in Christian circles he's known as James the Younger. I actually think he was the oldest disciple by some way. And I think he's called the Less not because of his age but because of his height. Like you might call me Little Jimmy. Mary must have been financial enough not to require Alpheus to exercise his Levirate responsibility, remember, like Boaz did to Ruth, to look after the children. That was certainly something that under the law was a requirement, but that didn't appear to be necessary. And remember that in Matthew we're told that Joseph was quite a bit older than Mary, and that makes sense when we carefully read about Jude. Now, I wonder if we're up to now. Gilfillan, just remind me your first name. Stephen. Hi, Stephen. Good to see you. Would you mind having a look at Luke chapter 6 and verse 16 for us? And this is probably where we're almost going to end it. I'll have a quick look at what's next.
Luke 6:16.
Yes, please.
And Judas, the brother of James, and Judas Iscariot, which also was the traitor.
So we've got, this is the disciple list. We've got Judas, the brother of James. Does anyone have an NIV or an ESV? Could you please read that for me?
Judas, the son of James.
The son of James. son James. Wow. So he's not James, the youngest one. He's got a kid who's a disciple, probably the youngest disciple in Jesus' group of disciples. To me, that would make James the oldest. This family network is getting tighter and tighter. Okay, what do we know about Jude? Well, he, like Judas Iscariot, wanted Jesus to be openly proclaimed as the Messiah, the Saviour of Israel. In John chapter 14 and verse 22, so this is at the Last Supper, he explained his worry about Jesus abandoning his messianic intentions. And as a consequence, Jude has become the patron saint of lost causes. And it's considered customary that if you are praying to St. Jude and he helps you, that you have to write in a newspaper that St. Jude has helped you. Now, I think, and I could be wrong here, but I suspect that tradition was either invented by the Murdochs or the Packers, because I don't know how many newspapers there were when Jude was around. We've established that the Galilee Gazette didn't post an ad for these disciples. The odd one out is Simon the Zealot. The Zealot. He's also known as Simon the... Now, this is a bonus points question if anyone gets this. Oh, I've got it up there. Oh, he's also known as Simon the Canaanite. Would Jesus choose a Gentile as part of his disciple posse? The answer to that is no. I don't think it means Canaan. I think it means that he came from Cana. I don't think Simon was a Gentile. But I do think he was called a zealot because he was a fanatic. The zealots liked to engage in skirmishes with the Romans. They wanted to be free from the Roman yoke. They were agitators, they were nationalists. The Jews in Jerusalem hated them because they just wanted peace and money. So it's a motley crew, isn't it? You've got Simon the tax hater joining up with Matthew the tax collector. You've got quiet, butter wouldn't melt in his mouth Nathaniel with the tempestuous and violent at times Peter. And then there's Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is the odd one out for one reason, and that was he lived in Kerioth. He didn't live around Galilee, but he was very well known to Jesus. He was described by Jesus in the Psalms as his own familiar friend. So I'm now going to take a big leap here. To get us to the Passover. With desire, I've desired to have this Passover with you. Jesus wanted to be with his best friends. This is his last meal. If I was having a last meal, who would I want to be with me?
Us.
Maybe. You haven't got any plans for me, have you? So maybe it's children or mum, but he didn't have a last meal with his kith and kin, did he? Mary, the aunties are all there. Remember, they're at the foot of crop. Tomorrow, we're going to see them. But he did have his last meal with his kith and kin. He had his last meal with his best friends, and here they all are. They're all his rellies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and a brother-in-law, or 2. So I think when we put this story together, it was a well-chosen group of people, but it wasn't only Jesus' choice. Do you know, in John, I think it's 14, it says about 6 times in Jesus' prayer that, God, these are the men that you have chosen for me. So it was a team effort. The disciples would eventually share in the loneliness of Jesus' suffering, but not before the meal. Psalm 38, Psalm 88, Psalm 31 describes Jesus wanting to be with his best friends, his familiar friends. That word familiar, if we go back to the 14th and 15th century, refers to your family or a servant that was so close who effectively became part of your family. I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbours, and an object of dread to my acquaintances, my closest friends. And that's what happened in just a couple of hours' time after this final meal. It's not a stretch at all to see this point of view of the psalmist, that his closest friends and acquaintances and his neighbours were his choice, because these messianic psalms prove that God would do that for him. But then he's got to choose another disciple, doesn't he? Because we know what happened with Judas. Jesus spent a whole night praying about this choice, about who would be his familiar friends. And it was a momentous decision. He probably had a broader group to choose from, and so some he had to exclude and some he included, and maybe there was a balance about who would be doing what, for whom and when. He knew these men would be taken away from their families. He knew these men would be sent all over the world and they'd be shouldering amazing responsibilities. But critically, their primary job was to be Jesus' best friend. A long night in prayer he spent praying for them, and there's an amazing mixture of people. A team of leaders who would have a special designation, not just as Jesus' disciples, but a special designation, as he says, in the kingdom. And they were a team who earned that right by giving up, or so it appears, their lives in the cruelest of ways, following the footsteps of their and our Master. Sorry I haven't had time to talk about what discipleship therefore means for us, but our time is up. So